Utah's literacy rates are prompting big concerns among Utah's top policymakers. So which education reforms are needed to make improvements?
We see over and over again that when students are given this systematic, intentional support, that they are able to learn to read at fairly high levels.
This week, we dive into new research on Utah's concerningly low literacy rates in public schools, why it caught the attention of Utah's governor, and how all forms of learning in an era of education choice can be part of the solution. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about something really essential to learning and education for young people here in Utah and really important for the future of the state overall, and it's the issue of literacy. Reading is one of the most essential variables that affect a whole range of downstream variables. And we're going to dive into some recent research and what it means for Utah. To have this conversation, I'm excited to welcome into our studio Andrea Brandley. She is a senior education analyst for the Kem C Gardner Policy Institute. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And in our virtual studio is Christine Cooke Fairbanks, our education policy fellow here at Sutherland. Christine, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be back. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to talk to both of you because, Andrea, you have a great new report from the Gardner Institute that sort of dives into this data and sort of has elevated this issue to a statewide priority in terms of some concerning statistics about the literacy rates here in Utah for our K-12 education population. I want to start off because this was something that the governor talked about in the State of the State address. So I want to share a brief excerpt that this is what the governor had to say in his State of the State address.
Nearly half of our third graders are not reading at grade level, and too many of those children never catch up. That should concern us because reading is how people learn to think and govern themselves. A society that cannot read cannot reason together. And when reasoning breaks down, power rushes in to fill the void. Our goal is this: every child reading well, early, and with confidence. That means high standards and individualized support for struggling readers. Literacy is a policy choice. It means families, schools, and the state pulling in the same direction. Literacy is moral infrastructure, and if we want our children to grow up and live free, purposeful lives, we must give them a strong foundation today.
Again, that's Governor Spencer Cox in his most recent State of the State address. Andrea, that the language of moral infrastructure really stood out to me, that the governor is essentially saying this actually is really essential for the state of Utah. So I give all of that context. I'd love to just hear you kind of give an overview for our audience, talk about your new report, what prompted the Gardner Institute to commission this report, and what did you find? What do we need to know?
Yeah, so thanks for that introduction. We, as the governor mentioned, we see that only about half of third graders are reading on grade level, and those rates are really similar when you look at kindergartners, first graders, second graders. And while we've seen a little bit of improvement over the last 5-ish years, we still remain below pre-pandemic levels for every grade besides kindergarten. So we do see, some significant reading challenges in our state. And, speaking to what the governor spoke to as well, there is so much data on the critical importance of literacy, particularly from a young age. So if you look at, how does reading proficiently by third grade relate to a whole host of outcomes later on in life, we see that students are about 4 times more likely not to graduate high school if they're not reading proficiently by third grade, based on a national study. We also see that students are much more likely to have stronger long-term employment outcomes, higher wages, all of these things that we kind of see as helping them to live successful lives as adults, participate more in these civic engagement type things. So it really does show in the research that it's a pretty critical component for development and for our students to grow into adults that we want to see that are contributing to society, that are living, happy, healthy lives. And we also see, I think, something that's kind of critical is that the research really shows that nearly all children can learn to read. So sometimes we face criticisms that, well, like some children, based on their background or based on their circumstance, maybe it's just not in the cards for them. And the research really doesn't bear that out. We see over and over again that when students are given this systematic intentional support, that they are able to learn to read at fairly high levels. So I think that that's, kind of a hopeful finding to say that this is something that we can work on and we can improve through time. I will also mention that this is not just a Utah problem. We see similar numbers nationally where about half of our kids are really kind of struggling to meet that benchmark. So something to be worked on here in Utah, and hopefully maybe we can lead out in the nation.
What is your sense in the evidence or in your paper as far as why is this metric the way that it is? I mean, is this, you mentioned that we're still below pre-pandemic levels. Is this still just lingering effects because of the pandemic? Or is there something kind of more structural going on that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do think that the pandemic definitely influenced things, but even the rates prior to the pandemic were sub 60%. So we still saw fairly low literacy rates prior to that. I think that literacy, particularly early literacy, is a complex topic when you think about what leads to a student being able to read by third grade. So of course, what happens in school in kindergarten, first and second is critically important. But we also see that the most rapid brain development is actually happening from ages 0 to 5. So before students even enter the school system. So as far as, causes and what can help students learn to read at a higher level, I think it really starts very, very early. And the more interactions that very young children can have with a caregiver, where they're having conversations back and forth with them, they're being read to on a regular basis, they're being sung to and told stories to, really is like a critical component of their brain developing in a way so that they are ready for that more formal instruction when school starts. And then, of course, we have also seen kind of across the nation big pushes in changes to the way that we approach literacy instruction. And I think that that's something that's been happening in Utah already. We had a bill passed in 2022 that really focused on teacher professional development, making sure we're using really strong evidence-based instruction in schools. So it's kind of, a big combination of trying to make sure that we have those really early interventions in place, along with making sure we have really strong Tier 1 instruction and then supports following that if needed.
Andrea, one thing that comes to mind for me too is because we've had so much discussion in the state in recent years and really around the country about a growing education choice landscape with a lot of parents, maybe being more interested in or taking greater advantage of different forms of schooling and education for their kids. How does the data in your report sort of account for that? We have traditional K-12 district schools, charter schools, homeschools, private schools. I mean, Christine could probably go down the list of all the different kinds of things we have in Utah now that's been growing in recent years. I guess, what does the data cover? What does it not cover? What do people need to know if they're looking at this data, wondering where any one particular type of schooling fits in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this particular report covers our public schools, which includes both charter schools and traditional district schools. And really, if you look at districts, across districts, we see proficiency rates ranging from 30% to like 70%, just above 70%. This is not in the report, but I do have data for charter schools as well, and it shows an even larger range, which makes sense because we're looking at an individual school level rather than across a full school district, but it ranges from roughly 15% all the way up to nearly 90% across charter schools. And if you look at individual district schools, you see similar trends. So really, what I think we see the most is that there's significant variation across all types of schools. So some schools have pretty high rates of literacy, some schools have much lower rates of literacy. And we see that this does correlate with economic disadvantage. So if a school is serving a larger population of students who come from an economically disadvantaged background, then they're more likely to have a larger share of their students that are not reading proficiently. But we also see schools that I guess I would say are bucking the trend. So they do serve a large share of economically disadvantaged students, and their literacy rates are still above the state average. So I guess I would say, it really varies from school to school, and I would suggest looking at the literacy rates of individual schools. That data is available to the public. And as far as, district versus charter, we really see a range across both, and the average is fairly similar. I wish I could. I can't really speak to private schools and homeschools. The data is just not readily available. But hopefully we can, put some things in place that will help improve literacy outcomes regardless of the schools that our students choose to attend.
Christine, I want to get your take, because Andrea mentioned some of the legislative efforts in the past. We're having this conversation in the middle of Utah's 2026 general legislative session, and I know this is a big topic on Utah's Capitol Hill. In fact, I think in a previous recent episode with you, kind of previewing education policy at the legislature, you made the comment that there are more bills on education than probably any other policy issue. So this is a big deal to lawmakers here in Utah. Can you kind of give us the latest on what's going on in sort of the education reform conversation here in Utah, especially as it relates to literacy? What should we be thinking about? What should we be talking about as a state if we look at these numbers in Andrea's report from Gardner Institute and say, how do we fix this? How do we make this better?
Yeah, so the heavyweight bill that was, much anticipated is SB 241, early literacy, and that went public last week. It actually passed out of the Senate Education Committee on Friday. And this is really building on, Andrea was talking about a bill that passed a few years ago. It's kind of building on that. I think the idea is that we've seen very modest progress. We're very unsatisfied with where we're at as a state, and so it's time to accelerate. And this bill focuses heavily on student interventions specifically, and so it continues this testing structure, a cadence, and so we can better assess where a student is in that whole K through 3 space. And then if a student is below benchmark, they can now have this specialized individual reading plan. And that's a big focus of the bill. And this is something that teachers and parents and maybe a reading specialist would work on and create for students. There is a list of interventions that you could use for a student, but that really is the focus. If you've followed some of the success stories of Mona Elementary, it has some similar features to that, where they really zeroed in on individualizing for students. So, and also this bill focuses on making sure that training is also really strong. There's a big ask for money for paraprofessionals, because they are a huge piece to this as well. So I think that's the piece. I mean, a controversial piece of the bill is third grade retention, right? So if by the time you get to third grade, you're not at benchmark, then they hold you back, right? This is something that I think there's legitimate concerns and discussion about it, whether or not this would be something that could stigmatize a student and make a situation worse. At the same time, it's a really strong incentive to get a team around that student and make sure that they don't get there. And of course, I mean, if you're following the discussion, everyone is reiterating the same point. We really don't want to get to that intervention, right? So hopefully doing everything you can. In fact, there's an option to even look at retention in the earlier grades. So maybe kindergarten, right? And if you kind of see some of these struggles there. So, and even there can be some exceptions or, when you're talking about third grade, if a student's not at benchmark, there can be some exceptions or some good cause reasons why you might be able to show that they need to move on to fourth grade anyways. But, I think that the goal of this, again, is to focus on the individual. I think that's a good thing. I think because there's been so much anticipation around this bill and work on it, I think it has a high likelihood of passage. So,
Christine, maybe one quick follow-up on that. And then, Andrea, I'd love to kind of hear some of your thoughts as well, as far as any other key things from your report that people need to know about, and kind of if you were to give kind of one big thing for Utah voters, Utah policymakers to take away from this to inform how they move forward. I want to get your take on that. But real quick, Christine, on the policy front, again, sort of as just a layman observer of this stuff, it seems like most of the momentum around our education policy reform conversations as a nation in recent years have been focused a lot on education choice. And we've talked a lot about on this show how states around the country, really since 2020 or so, since the pandemic, there's been a very dramatic increase in those kinds of programs. And I think that's great. I love education choice. I think it's essential. Choice and options for parents is really important. But is there any risk that we are sort of not giving enough attention to things, sort of those core foundational things like literacy, maybe basic math skills? I mean, sort of these core educational benchmarks that, can happen constructively in a variety of different learning settings. But I guess what I'm asking is this a needed sort of refocusing of the education reform conversation broadly? Not that we ignore or stop doing everything else we've been doing, but just sort of elevating or maybe re-elevating the importance of things like literacy. Is that sort of hey, guys, like, let's remember, this is actually what education is all about. We can't lose sight of this.
It's certainly. And I think that actually both are happening at the same time. So choice has been growing, but I also think awareness of literacy has been growing at the same time. Specifically, the science of reading has, kind of taken center stage. And so, it's just the background. There's kind of been this battle of whole language learning, to reading instruction versus the more traditional or science of reading like phonics and comprehension and things like that. And then there have been some other pieces that have, kind of stoked the fire a little bit. There was a podcast in 2022 that spread awareness around the fact that kind of the whole language approaches were failing our students. And then there's a really well-known example, Mississippi Miracle, that state brought up their reading scores from like 49th to 9th in about a little over a decade. And they really focused on science of reading. By the way, they used third grade reading retention or grade retention for those that weren't reading at grade level. So a lot of people look to those. And both of and there's much more than that, but they have created this, I guess, kind of consensus around the fact that, yes, we need to focus on reading. Yes, there is a right way. In a sense, there's a data-backed way to approach this. So I think both have been kind of growing alongside each other. I think that's great. As parents are making choices, you also want them to be aware of what good choices are, right? And so as they're seeking if they're going to do a home-based curriculum, like be aware of what this discussion is, and hopefully the resources grow as well.
Andrea, final thoughts as far as anything else from your report that you think is really important for folks to kind of remember and take away from, and especially for the policy conversation as we're having conversations here in Utah's legislature. Obviously, this issue is important nationally, but are there any kind of key things that if you were speaking to elected officials, you would say, hey, this is like the one big thing you need to remember and help guide your reform conversations? What would be top of mind for you?
Yeah, so I think that I'm grateful to have kind of the policy summary. I think that policy is a critical step, a critical first important step, and really helps as a state for all of us to get on the same page and see where we want to go and what is our goal. I also think it's very clear in the research, both of Mississippi and of other states, that implementation is what drives results. So I think that it's really critical to have all of these frameworks in place and to make sure that we have the resources we need and the interventions and the reading plans, and then really making sure that this is trickling down to school districts and trickling down to individual schools, and then ultimately trickling down to individual classrooms, right? Because no matter what our policy is, if we don't have a teacher in the classroom or a teacher in the home or wherever the teacher is, that's really following this science of reading-based approach, then, it doesn't get to the end of the road. It doesn't get to the student. So I think that that's just, one of the bigger findings of the research is just to say, hey, this really kind of takes everyone, and it takes time, and it takes us all continuing down the same path for a while before we get there. And then I also just think, so the Clark and Christine Ivory Foundation is actually who reached out to us to do this particular report, which I first just want to thank them for doing that, but also want to say that I think that that's just a signal that we have, strong business and community leaders who are also very invested in this issue, which is helpful to say, hey, look, we're going to look at this from a school's perspective, from a community and business perspective, from a policy perspective. And the more we can, kind of all get on the same page, on the same boat, rowing in the same direction, I think the bigger difference we likely can make.
Well, we need to take a quick break. We're going to continue the conversation with some other voices in the education world here in Utah. I just want to underscore, Andrea, that last point you made, that it takes everyone. I mean, I've worked in governor's administrations in the past and worked on state of the state addresses. The fact that this got into Governor Cox's state of the state is a big deal. And the fact that the other folks you're talking about are involved, I just love that idea. It takes everyone, and this is really important for the state of Utah, and I'm confident we'll get it right. So thank you for your research and for sharing your findings here with us on Defending Ideas.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Christine is sticking around with us, and we're going to talk to some other important voices on the education landscape issues here in Utah. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to continue our conversation about education policy in Utah and things like literacy and how education resources that are part of the choice landscape can actually be really important to helping to boost core education metrics. Before we dive in, I want to remind you, if you like this conversation, if you enjoy what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org, where you can access this and previous episodes, or find us wherever you watch or listen to your shows. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Pick your favorite platform and search for Defending Ideas, and make sure to hit that subscribe button. So to continue the conversation, I'm excited to welcome into our studio Carolyn Sharette. She's the president of American Preparatory Schools. Carolyn, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
We're glad to talk to you, and Christine, of course, is going to stick with us throughout this episode to help us make sense of this important issue. And as we've been talking about so far in this discussion, the very idea of literacy seems so important and essential to learning. We've talked about how the governor mentioned it in the State of the State. I've always heard from education practitioners that in the early years, kids are learning to read, and then after that, they're reading to learn. And so it's kind of hard to overstate how important it is. And when we're trying to grapple with things like that as a state for essentially how do we boost literacy rates, how do we improve core education metrics, it seems important to look at the entire landscape of school types and education types in the state. And so maybe I want to ask you, as folks in Utah think about how to address this challenge, where are the bright spots? And you, as the practitioner in the charter school world, I think can kind of shed some light on where we're doing well. What do people need to know? What does our audience need to know about how things are actually going in terms of things like literacy rates?
Wow, that's a great question. And I love the bright spots. There are some really remarkable bright spots in the state of Utah. SB 127 has now been in effect for a couple of years. And so we had data from that was released in the fall of 2024 and data that was released in the fall of 2025. So we have 2 years of data to look. And as we looked at the results in 2024, we saw that I believe it was, and I can check for sure, but I'm thinking out of the top 10 schools that scored that year, it was 5 were charter schools, I believe. Or maybe it was 4 the first year and 5 this last year. So we're seeing that's when you take the schools, not the districts, all the schools in the state of Utah, and you look at their results. About half have been charter schools in the top 10. And then you also can look as districts, which is trickier because charter schools are actually considered districts. And so each little teeny charter school is its own district. So you can look at the scores as far as districts too. And I'm interested in that because the schools that I managed through a contract, I managed about 5,500 students at 7 campuses for American Preparatory Academy. And so we're a pretty large district, meaning we're about halfway in the state size of districts, of traditional district size. And so we're number 4. So in the top 10 districts, all those little charter schools count too, but our district is there at number 4. And so it's cool to look at these numbers and see where the bright spots are. And we have that data now. Maybe that's the best part, is that we have the data now and we can look and see and really start to hone in on the best practices that are working.
And as you mentioned, SB 127, that was a Senate bill from a few years ago, right? Is that what created sort of this data apparatus to give us the numbers you're talking about?
Absolutely. Yep. The state was required through that bill to have to set a standard. Well, the standard was set in the bill that schools and districts need to meet 70% of their kids at grade level reading in 3rd grade. And that's what they identified what that would be. They asked the State Board of Education to hone in on exactly what that meant, which they did in rule following that. And now we know what the goal is. And we've had 2 years of data to look at how schools have been doing.
Carolyn, one of the things I want to ask is, those sound like encouraging numbers, obviously, to see some of those rankings with charter schools doing well. Why do you think that is? What is unique about those charters that are doing well, especially when it comes to literacy rates, helping kids read? I mean, my wife and I, we have 2 little boys. They're very young, so they're still a little upstream from some of these kinds of things. But with our 4-year-old, we're in the process of teaching him how to read, and he's learning fast and learning a lot. So we're kind of very early on, just as parents, in that experience. But it just anecdotally, it's hard, kind of helping our son learn how to read, just because he's trying to maintain their focus and attention and those kinds of things. So how do you do it? How do you do it well? How do charters do it? I mean, this is one of those core foundational education metrics that are essential for the rest of life as kids grow up. What's kind of the secret, if you will, of why some charters can actually do really well at this?
I'm going to talk about specifically us first, American Prep, because last year when the first scores came out, our Draper 1 campus, which was the school that I opened in 2003, was number 1 in the ranking, which was exciting to me because I came here in 2003 and opened a school using what's called science of reading curriculum. That's what SB 127 is all about, is you have to use a certain kind of teaching, which goes back to phonics and things that most parents have heard of. So we know now without any question that the best way to teach reading is to make sure kids learn through phonics how to identify automatically all those sound symbol correlations and do it really well. And so we've been able to kind of emerge from 4 decades of questioning on how we're supposed to teach reading. We're not questioning anymore. We know how to do it. And I came here 23 years ago to bring those programs here. And so it was very exciting for me to see those results come out the first year and show that it was working and be able to show the world that it's working. I've had those results for 23 years at our school. So we now know how. We now have the motivation because the state has told us what we need to do, and we need to use a certain kind of curriculum. And so I think charter schools generally use that kind of curriculum more. They're quicker to do it. When they opened, a lot of them opened because they wanted to use that kind of curriculum. And so they've had more longevity with it. They may have been using it the whole time they've been open, like we have. Whereas districts sometimes are just kind of trying to jump in the last few years to really implement these kinds of programs.
Christine, I want to ask you, if kind of channeling the parent kind of thing, if I'm a parent who says, well, I want to make sure wherever my kids learn, wherever they go to school, whatever their learning environment is, I want to, if I say, well, I really prioritize literacy, which to a certain extent we all should because it's so important, but thinking through the lens of parents trying to make decisions about how and where their kids' education comes from, which is kind of a key priority of Utah. We've had many discussions with you on this show and with folks from the state, from the governor's administration, that parental choice, kind of parents owning and driving their kids' education, is a core Utah principle. And so in that landscape of education choice that sometimes can be a hotly debated topic, Christine, how do you see the idea of education choice and the idea of innovation that comes from that choice fitting into this conversation about things like literacy rates and the kinds of things that charter schools are doing?
I mean, the beauty and benefit of education choice is that you can find these success stories, these bright spots. It's similar in a way when we talk about laboratories of democracy. You can find what works, and you find the success early on. You can kind of share those ideas. Charter schools, because they have the opportunity to innovate, sometimes end up being the leaders and highlighting where the success stories can be. And I think it's good news. We obviously just had National School Choice Week, and Utah is doing well in terms of national rankings of having a lot of education choice. Charter schools are certainly a part of that. And I just think that the environment has shifted. I thought there's some really useful polling that the National School Choice Week organization did. They surveyed almost 4,000 parents of school-age children, and they found that 75% this year considered looking at other schools. And that's a jump from the year prior, and 60% of parents. But I mean, that in a year is a huge jump. But 75% of parents are saying, let me look at my options. So that's huge. And then, a chunk, I think it was like a little over 20% actually did find a different option for their kids. And amongst that group, a big chunk said they wanted to change because of educational themes or emphasis. And so you can see how literacy could fit into that. A parent might be saying, hey, my child's struggling. Can I go to a school that is succeeding, that's doing really well? So that's exciting. I mean, I think it's even broader. I know, Nick, you and I have discussed a lot about choice, including public choice, education choice. Lots of times we think about it in terms of these private choice programs, but the foundation is really options within the public choice system. And, there's been a lot of news coverage also in Juab School District about Mona Elementary. And they had a gain of 20% increase of students in third grade who are now proficient. And they have highlighted what they've done. I think a lot of it was one-on-one attention to students, a lot of assessing throughout consistently instead of just at the end of term assessment. They brought in parents, had a meeting for them, had videos and things to get them on board, which is huge. So, and that's relevant to this as well, because open enrollment, which is where you can also go from one public district school to another, requires that we have choices and options and success stories. And so I'm just really excited about that. One thing I will note, the Utah State Board of Education has this tool, the school report cards, and they just updated it for the 2024-25 school year, I think. So parents can go on there and look up traditional district schools and charter schools and look at how they're doing in achievement and growth and all the key core subject areas, which is really useful as they're making choices. So I just think choice is going to be part of this discussion, right, as we find what works.
Carolyn, can I ask you, one of the things that I'm curious about is going back to this idea of the science of reading and phonics, maybe colloquially called. Again, so coming from a non-education policy expert perspective, why does it seem a little bit like a new thing? I mean, I remember hearing about phonics, probably doing phonics when I was a kid. You said it kind of was maybe out of style for a while. Can you help our listeners understand just the education policy world, how we kind of went from where we were in the past and now saying, well, no, let's embrace the science of reading. Help us understand that trajectory and why this is an important conversation now for how to improve literacy moving forward.
Well, it's been an important conversation for my whole life. And we have gone through the reading wars of the 80s and 90s, 2000s. No Child Left Behind came in. I want to go back, though, to the 60s, which is when the first science of reading programs were published. DISTAR was published in 1969. You can look at that one. It's kind of cool. And they're still publishing related programs, but they were met with excessive opposition. And as whole language as an idea, and now a failed idea, we know is teaching whole language as a reading strategy is a failed idea. But that was sweeping the nation, coming from both coasts, and mostly the West Coast, however, I will say. In California, they started with whole language. In 70s and 80s and 90s. And No Child Left Behind in the early 200s was an initiative by the federal government to try to get people back to science of reading. So I thought we were on the road then to make it happen. And when I got here in 2001 and started using reading mastery among our constellation of reading programs at our school, we have many that we use. but that's one of the central programs that we use. I still found a lot of opposition here in Utah to using that kind of curriculum. As late as last year, after the first results were out, we were told by the State Office of Education they would not approve Reading Mastery as a new Science of Reading program in the state. It was troublesome because in the top 10 schools, about 5 of them were using some form of Reading Mastery. And the data didn't seem to help us. It didn't help us make our case. And they pushed and pushed that we were not going to be able to use our programs. But we pushed back pretty hard as well. And luckily, most of the schools stayed with their programs. Some did jump ship, which made me sad. But there's just, the problem is that but the colleges of education, most of the state colleges of education, don't teach Science of Reading. They didn't. Now with SB 127, it reached all the way in to the colleges and universities. So now we're going to get that from our teachers, and it'll start to shift even faster. But it's very much a philosophical debate, and that's why homeschool, private school, charter schools kind of always stayed with that more traditional reading program, which now the science has borne out is the best way to teach. And it's going to take some time before our public schools, which receive their teachers from the public universities, can make the switch back into this Science of Reading curriculum and do it really effectively.
Carolyn, maybe one last question in this segment. We're a little bit over time, but I think that this is an important conversation. What do you see in these kinds of conversations we're having as a state, that we're having as a nation, that maybe are blind spots or things that we need to remember? In other words, what are the kinds of kind of key takeaways from all this? Whether someone's a policymaker, an educator, a parent, what's like the one big thing that you wish everyone would just remember, so that as we have these kinds of conversations about literacy and the different schooling types moving forward, what's the thing we need to keep top of mind?
The thing is, we must do what's best for kids. We always have to look through the lens of what is best for kids, and teaching kids to read fluently and comprehend well is what is best for them. So when the data show us what that is, we have to be willing to put our pride on the side. We have to be willing to do it. And even if it's something we've been taught for years or thought, we have to give up those long-held positions to do what's best for kids.
Christine, we'll give you the last word for this segment. Any key takeaways you would articulate to policymakers, to parents, to educators? I know we'll continue this conversation into the last segment of this episode, but anything on your mind that we're missing that we want to make sure is very clear to our audience about what's important and what's at stake about this literacy conversation we're having as a state right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that we need to keep the main thing, which is educating children. We've already articulated how important reading is. I think it's a positive sign that the legislature and the governor have it top of mind and they want to address it. And I do think, we were talking earlier about data. I know in education, data-driven is like a really big term. Let it be data-driven. I think the beauty about having more data is we can find where it's leading us. And so I'm hopeful that we're landing in the right direction. I mean, as far as the Science of Reading goes, at this point, it has caught on that this is the direction to go. 40 plus states now have some sort of legislation and this is like since 2019, right? In a short period of time, I think we've sort of understood where we need to go. But so I'm hopeful that our legislature can get it right over time.
Well, let's take a break before we go into our third segment. Carolyn, again, so grateful for you for being with us, and Christine, of course, throughout this discussion. We'll keep watching this issue and trying to elevate these data points and these principles to improve these things moving forward for the state. So thanks for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue our conversation about education policy in Utah and how to improve things like literacy and other core education metrics that are really foundational to long-term learning and development for our kids here in the state. I want to remind you before we jump back into the conversation, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access this and previous episodes, and find us wherever you like to listen to podcasts or watch. We're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify, on YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas on your favorite platform and click that subscribe button. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the bell icon so you get a notification each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, all that and more wherever you get your shows or at defendingideas.org. To continue this conversation, I'm excited to bring into the studio Leland Anderson. He is the principal of American Heritage School, the Salt Lake City campus. Leland, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thanks, Nick. It's good to be with you today.
We're grateful for you being with us because we've been having this conversation. Of course, Christine sticking with us through the whole episode as we really try and make sense of this literacy conversation we're having as a state right now, and talking about what we can do as a state. How do we leverage sort of all the levers in our education apparatus as a state to try and boost literacy rates and create better outcomes for our students, because that's so important. Leland, maybe to start off, how do you all do it at American Heritage? What's maybe unique or different when you think of, well, I mentioned in the previous segment, when kids are little, they're learning to read, then they're reading to learn. That's really essential. How do you all approach this issue?
Well, there are laws to literacy. Gaining literacy is a complex task, and it doesn't happen by accident. It always happens on purpose. It happens with caring adults who teach children. And in this state, of course, we have lots of caring adults, parents who love their children, who want to teach them, teachers who are so well prepared. And yet, as the governor mentioned, we're struggling on our literacy rates right now. And there are lots of reasons for that, but there are also lots of answers. And American Heritage School's answers begin in kindergarten. We're a K through 12 school. And so, of course, we admit families who resonate with our mission, and many times those are families that want a faith-oriented environment as well. But you don't have to have all of that in order to learn good literacy. Right? Literacy starts with understanding phonograms. We have a system that we call Spalding. It's actually available to everyone. They have 87 phonograms that are learned between first and second grade. And there's just a repeated, deliberate, systematic approach that's traditional and involves writing and learning the sounds at the same time. And any child who does this, from any background, any ethnic background, any home, can learn to read. We've got a teacher right now, a kindergarten teacher, who taught for 35 years in a local public school and then came and for the last 4 years has been at our campus, and she said, I wish I had had this the entire time because it's so clear and so systematic that the students learn to spell and write all at the same time. Of course, in the state, metrics begin in third grade because by that time we hope students have gained a basic literacy level. We don't measure a kindergartner's literacy, at least not in a formal way. And those Acadience tests that the state kick in third grade, we don't do that test, but we do a STAR test by Renaissance. And it shows, this test is taken by 18 million people across the nation annually, and shows that our students are performing well above their reading levels because they're following the basic levels and basic rules of literacy, of learning to read and write and spell according to basic phonics. So, we take that approach. It's traditional. We think Spalding is better than most programs out there. This teacher I have said, I think the state should consider it statewide. And she said this to me organically before I even knew I was going to be on this podcast. But I got to say, we see the results. By third grade, over 86% of our students this year are reading on or above level, compared with about 49% in the state. And that's even higher than 90% by fourth grade. And so there are tried and true methods. There are laws to literacy. Anyone who follows those laws or those principles can gain literacy. So we've got to popularize those and implement them better, more systematically.
86%, that's a really compelling statistic, especially because then the previous segments where we're talking about kind of the lower rates at the state level that are concerning. What would you say if there are other parents out there that say, well look, I really want to make sure that my children, excel when it comes to literacy, or if there's other educators or even policymakers, how would you characterize your role at American Heritage and maybe kind of in the broader ecosystem of the education system? What is the role that you all bring to the table as far as helping have high literacy rates for our kids? What do people need to understand about why that's an important piece of the puzzle?
Yeah. Well, of course, in education at American Heritage School, we like to think that there are 4 main core elements to instruction. The first is that you've got to have a student, and then you have caring adults, including a teacher and a parent or more than one parent, and then the right curriculum. And of course, students are so malleable in their young, early literacy years, which is what Governor Cox was talking about so much, right? Early literacy, start them right, give them the support that they need. Teachers who have the right tools and have devotion to teaching this grade level, this age level, will do a good job. And parents, of course, will do that as well. The curriculum is that tool, and not all literacy curricula are created equal. They are just not. I've spoken with several early literacy teachers, K through 3 teachers, who have realized that some are better than others. And so, as a school, and particularly a private school that's free to quickly innovate and adapt, and we've had this system now for many years because it's been getting such good results for us. Well, we would love to help popularize that and provide that for more parents. Perhaps if you're asking about the broader question of school choice, since we are an independent school, a private school, the same arguments for choice apply K through 12, right? If you have the choice to choose, if I were to say to you, you can only use one kind of pen or one car or 2 types of cars, right? Or maybe you have just very limited choices of what you can wear, where you can live, that would be a very restrictive environment. And for us in education to be able to say as a state, this is an education destination, come to Utah. You can choose any of our excellent public schools, our excellent charter schools, our excellent private schools. You have a range, a menu, a smorgasbord to choose from. That's going to attract wonderful people here because they want that kind of liberty with their schools as they have with almost everything else in their lives. And they'll vote with their feet. They'll share. They'll be sneezers and share the good news of the good programs they found wherever they found them. And there are great schools out there, not just mine, but many great schools. So that choice will lift all boats. And we believe that the invisible hand works in schools just like it does for other segments of the economy.
Christine, building off of what Leland said, the kind of this apparatus of school choice, and I love the way you described that we have great options. We should aspire to have great options in kind of every category. Christine, there is kind of this ongoing policy debate in the educational world right now. I mean, we've seen this across the nation when it comes to school choice debates, but here in Utah, because of the Utah Fits All scholarship that exists, it's on the books, but there's this lawsuit effort to get rid of it. How do you see this fitting in? Because it seems to me that what Leland just described is very compelling, that, we should be able to empower parents with a wide variety of choices. Utah Fits All is sort of a mechanism that helps a lot of those choices be more within reach for a lot of these parents, but yet it's in debate right now in the state. How do you sort of see that program being relevant to the choice issue when it comes to things like reading and literacy that we're trying to figure out how to improve in Utah?
Yeah, I mean, education choice, especially, we talked about this in the last segment. Choice can lead to success stories that shine a light on how to do it right. That's something policymakers can pay attention to and study, and it's something that parents can just choose. So, in my mind, it's obvious that this should be part of the solution when we're trying to overcome a challenge like low literacy rates. I mean, the great thing about an education savings account, which the Utah Fits All program is how personalized an education can be. So, obviously you can spend the funds on tuition at a great private school like American Heritage. You say, I like that program. I like the results they're getting. I want to go there. A parent could spend it on homeschool or home-based curriculum and specific tutoring. So this really a la carte version. So you can imagine how reading interventions can be really targeted for the individual student. And that's what's so important. You could hire reading tutors. Say the issue is actually dyslexia. You can find somebody who's a specialist and trained in helping kids learn to read if they are struggling with dyslexia. So to me, I think it's almost a no-brainer. I think some of the issues that keep cropping up are specific to this legislative session as well. Funding and then accountability is like this evergreen issue. So obviously there's energy behind the literacy. So the base budget has already been passed, which that's sort of wet cement in a way. The actual numbers will be determined later, but several line items in there for early literacy. And there's also money for Utah Fits All. There's been some discussion about the state board recommending to cut funding from Utah Fits All. I think it'd be interesting to see how easily that could happen. I kind of have my doubts. But I think that we'd want to put funds in Utah Fits All and see how this sort of improves this discussion as well. And it's a release valve, again, for students that really aren't finding success in some of the options that they already have. And then there's this discussion about accountability, and Leland did a great job of talking about, voting with their feet. Ultimately, parents choosing is accountability. There is something to be said for having tests that easily compare. So like a standardized test is useful because you can compare apples to apples, and that has its place. But a lot of families that are seeking Utah Fits All, that's not their highest priority in determining whether or not their student is succeeding. And so maybe they go to a private school that has a testing system they really like. Maybe they just want to do things at home and they don't want to do that. They want to observe other ways if their student is thriving and if they're reading. So that's all very relevant. And I think we ought to be open to what accountability really means. At the end of the day, a parent is going to be a lot more keyed in, almost always, right? Typically, to how a student is actually doing in terms of reading and their struggles and what's really holding them back. So I definitely see Utah Fits All as relating to this issue as well.
Can I make a comment about that? Just the idea that parents are the first teachers is really powerful. As a principal of a school, I have teachers who spend time with children every day for a certain number of days per year. That might add up to several hundred hours per year, but the time a parent spends with a child dwarfs the time any teacher spends. Even if a teacher spends close to 1,000 hours with a child, that over summers, weekends, nights, holidays, right, multiple years, and not just for the few years during their early years, but throughout their entire school experience, parents dwarf teachers by 10 times and more sometimes because of the amount of physical time they have with their children. They love their children, they always will, and of course teachers are so loving, but there's a unique role for parents. And I think we should assume that all parents have the best interest of their children in mind and heart, and will do all they can to provide an excellent education. It's very few exceptions to that, very few.
I think that's a good point, especially when we talk about this concept of education choice and the Utah Fits All scholarship. It really does come back to the parents. And there's something just central in Utah's ethos as a state. We had the governor's education advisor here on the show a while back, where he was essentially saying, like, look, this is the position of Utah. The parents are, I think the term is the first educators or the first decision makers, maybe another way to put it, when it comes to how their kids learn. And I think it's in that context that Christine, I want to follow up on something you said, that some conversations about potentially cutting funding to Utah Fits All. Obviously, if we're in a tight budget year, it's natural to look for places to save money. But just, again, kind of coming at this as not the education policy expert, but it seems that if the state's in a literacy crisis, which maybe you could call this that, maybe that's too dramatic of language, but if the state is really trying to grapple with how to boost literacy rates, that seems like a terrible time to cut a program like Utah Fits All, because it's so geared toward putting parents in the driver's seat and helping to foster choice and innovation. Because to me, it seems like, well, if we're trying to figure out ways to boost literacy, what we need is as much creative problem solving as possible, which means we need innovation, which means that we need choice and options in different schooling types. Is that off base, or is that the right way to think about how these things can actually work together and this choice landscape and different options are an asset to boosting and improving literacy.
So first of all, I don't think it's too strong a language to call it a crisis. But I agree. I mean, ultimately, if what we're doing is seeking for solutions, why remove solutions, right? It's like put more things on the table, not less. And that's how I would view it. Um, I understand that the budget is a finite pool and that there are realities that exist, of course. But in terms of trying to tackle literacy, I would say let's try and do both, and keep these both high priorities. So, yeah, I would agree.
Look, we're almost out of time. Leland, I want to give you the last word, and Christine, maybe some final thoughts from you. What stands out to you from this entire conversation that if there's a really important takeaway for policymakers, especially in this session, or for parents or educators, what's kind of the one big thing from this entire conversation you want to make sure doesn't get lost on our audience when they finish watching or listening to this?
Sure. Yeah, I was actually going to mention, I know in the last segment I talked about this polling data, and I just thought this was relevant as well. Parents who seek for information about their schooling or some trends about what they choose, typically after parents search, they are more likely to choose a private school. They're more likely to choose homeschool. They're more likely to choose a micro school. So I would say let's also listen to the parents about what they think is a solution for their kids. I think this is just a growing, we've talked about this like a new culture. And so I would say policymakers they would do well to listen to that as well.
Leland, final thoughts. What's the one big thing that people need to take away from this conversation to keep in mind as we're talking about things like Utah Fits All, education choice, open enrollment, literacy, these pretty important education topics moving forward? What's the one thing you want to make sure people don't forget?
Well, I want to unify us, number one. I think all Utahns want this. I don't know a single Utahn who doesn't want children to read well, who doesn't want an educated populace, who doesn't want that for any of those who are fortunate to live in this state, regardless of where they may have lived in the past. We all are unified in what we want. And the question of how to get there is sometimes where there's some disagreement about whether it should are we going to hurt public schools because perhaps we're allowing Utah Fits All to give some choice to some parents. And I have to think that history proves the idea that people are wise and there's an invisible hand that guides market forces. If I were to go to a school and find that my child was not doing well at that school, regardless, even a private school, I would pull them out because I would see the fruits of that. And a parent who is close to the child knows those fruits. Of course, there could be studies done. There are 15,000 students now on the UFA. Maybe a few thousand of those could be incentivized to come and take some assessments. It's a very difficult and complicated research project if you want academic proof, which would probably show modest gains. It wouldn't show drastic gains, but would show modest improvement, very likely. That's what's been shown with other studies in other states in the past that have had voucher systems and free choice systems. So it's likely that would be the case. But those modest gains add up. And those gains add up in other ways too, not just literacy numbers, but in wellness and health. And we have to trust that the invisible hand works. It works across so many sectors. When you give people choice, they're smart, they'll figure it out. And we need good teachers everywhere, right? We're not putting teachers out of jobs. They may go from a private to a public or a public to a private. Thank goodness we have wonderful teachers in this state. And they'll have freedoms in certain ways in certain school systems that are just delicious and wonderful to them. So let's agree that we all want the same thing. And I hope we can agree that that markets respond and people are smart. And this is a crisis we can beat together if we're willing to innovate together. And so that's one of the reasons I'm confident that we're going to continue to improve, especially with choice. Choice initiatives will help. And of course, a good old return to family values, parents being close to their kids, really helping early on, being present, limiting screen time, right? Reading to their kids, doing all they can to get educated as a parent about literacy. And maybe principals can put up some money to train their teachers in different systems and maybe invite the parents too so they can get some literacy instruction. Working together, parents and teachers can accomplish a lot. We can beat this. We can do this.
Well, we will leave it there for time, but obviously the conversation continues. This is a really important issue for the state of Utah. Leland Anderson, again, president of American Heritage School, Salt Lake City.
Principal, yeah.
Principal of American Heritage School, Salt Lake City. Thanks for that correction.
Yeah.
But thanks for being here and sharing your expertise. It's really helpful to the conversation.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And thanks, of course, to Christine Cooke Fairbanks, our education policy fellow here at Sutherland. That is it for this segment. Stick around. We have one more break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back, and thanks to each of our guests who rounded out today's discussion. For you and I, here's a key message we can share about core educational issues like literacy, and that's this. Because there is a strong sense that it will take everyone in the state to strengthen reading outcomes for young students, that principle also applies to the education landscape itself, meaning we should embrace the full suite of options that Utah's education choice landscape provides to families as tools in creative problem solving to find and test innovative ways to boost literacy and other important outcomes. This is one of the greatest assets of a robust education choice landscape, innovation that leads to better outcomes for Utah kids. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org. You can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it valuable. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.